Who here thinks transcription is the best way to become a better improviser? If that's the case, why is this approach so rarely taught in school in the full ensemble big band setting?
It's too time-consuming. Every jazz solo is too hard for my students. If we spend all this time transcribing, when will we learn the modes? I've never transcribed anything before. I just don't know where to start.
Okay. Those are all valid concerns when trying to teach transcription in the full ensemble. However, since we know that this is the best way for students to improve as improvisers, it's really key for us as educators to figure out ways to incorporate this into our full ensemble rehearsals. Today, we're going to go through the step-by-step process to help you and your students transcribe your first solo in a large ensemble setting. All right, if you're a music educator and you've committed to making transcription part of how you work with your students, there's a few key components you're going to want to consider in order to make sure that you and your students can be successful. The first and most important thing you're going to want to think about is making sure you choose the right solos to transcribe. Now, when you're choosing solos for your students to transcribe, you're going to need to think about clearly the difficulty level, but also how that's going to work across all the different instruments. And keep in mind that you don't have to do entire solos. It's very common, and I think actually more successful for earlier improvisers to think about doing one chorus of a solo, or maybe just a couple phrases, or even just one lick. These smaller transcription chunks can really help your students feel confident and successful on these early transcription projects, so that way when they go in to take more difficult and longer solos apart, they'll feel confident that they have the tools for success. The second key component to being successful when teaching transcription in a large ensemble might seem obvious, but that's to work in small chunks. And when I say small chunks, I mean microscopic chunks in some cases. This might be a measure, 2 beats. This part of the transcription process is something that I think is sometimes overlooked by people who are unfamiliar with it. The amount of times that you're going to have to rewind, listen, rewind, listen, rewind, listen on small chunks to really make sure you're getting notes and rhythms accurately is significant and something that your students really need to get accustomed to. Now, when we're going through this process of transcription, the first thing we want to do is listen a lot. But the second thing we want to do is actually not go to our horn. We want to sing. Now, when we talk about using our voice to transcribe, we're hopefully eventually going to get to pitch accuracy, but many of your students might need some practice there. I certainly did when I was a younger musician. What we're really talking about is getting rhythm and phrasing with our voice. If we really think about being able to sing an entire chorus or at least an entire phrase before we go to putting it on our horn, we're going to have a much easier time getting the rhythm and the phrasing. Yes, the notes we might still have to figure out a little bit, but that rhythm and phrasing will get us a lot of the way there towards being to accurately play that idea. The final thing we want to think about when we're working on transcription in the full ensemble is to not give students any other options but to transcribe. So often as educators, when we're teaching improvisation, we're looking to give students shortcuts to success rather than support to success. Whether it's trying to get them to think about a certain scale that will work over an entire tune or a certain small chunk of music theory that will kind of be like the secret to improvising. What we really need to focus on is them slowly developing the various different skills that they need. And just like when we're improvising, transcription has these same small sets of skills that we need to work on. Now, this doesn't mean that you're never going to need to give your students sort of the answer about what are the notes in this line or what does this particular player play. However, the more you can guide them to those answers versus just giving it to them, and especially avoiding giving it to them written out on a piece of sheet music, the better off their transcription skills will develop over time. All right, let's get into our example. As I mentioned, solo selection is really, really important. And today we're going to look at the Miles Davis solo on Freddie Freeloader off of the album Kinda Blue. This is the first solo that I transcribe with any student working on improvisation. And I've done this with students as early as maybe 6th grade and then all the way through students in high school and beyond, depending on where they are in the transcription process. Now, you might be asking yourself, Sean, why don't we just listen to Miles play this? For YouTube copyright reasons, I just went ahead and played the solo, But I would really encourage you to either first go check out the Miles Davis version. It starts at about 2 minutes and 12 seconds into the recording, or better yet, as you're actually watching this lesson, just pull up the YouTube video of Miles playing this in a window next to it and follow along through the solo as we're going. I'll put a link down in the description so you can just click on it and pull it up, but that would be the best way to view this content today. Now, we just did the first chorus there, and that's usually where I start with most of my students, sometimes the first 2 choruses depending on the player. I like to start with this solo because it has a range that's very achievable for most intermediate level players. Yes, it goes up to a high flat there at the end, but there are some ways you can work around that, and most of it stays in a really comfortable range. Additionally, it has very, very clear phrases. We have an idea, little rest, idea, little rest, so on and so forth. So it's very easy to sort of break this up into little transcribable chunks. Now that we've heard the solo and heard a little bit about why we want to work on this, let's actually get into the nitty-gritty of how we're going to do this in a step-by-step process. All right, day 1 of working on this solo with your students. The first thing you're going to do is listen through what you want to transcribe and maybe even a little bit more of the solo so students can get the entire idea of what's going on. Now, you're going to do another listening, and before you do that, I would encourage you to ask them a sort of guided question to get them thinking critically about what they're going to listen to. What sections of this solo do you think are going to be challenging to learn? Which sections are going to be easy to learn? How many chunks are in this solo? You listen again. Then maybe another round of listening with another guided question, or maybe soliciting some responses from them. We want to do at least 3 to 5 listenings on that day 1. Now, once we do that, that's all we're worried about on the first day, is just listening and thinking critically about that solos so students hear it a bunch of times before they have to worry about transcribing it. All right, now we're on day 2 of working on this solo. We're going to start by just working on that first chorus. We're going to listen to that 1 to 2 times with no questions, no guidance, just listening intently. Now, once we've done a couple listenings of the whole first chorus, we're going to really narrow it down to just one phrase or one idea. In this solo, that first idea sounds like this. Just like we started with, where we wanted to listen to it a couple times, we're going to listen to just that phrase, probably 2 to 3, maybe even as many as 5 times, till we feel like the students can sing along with it. Now, in this case, that's a pretty straightforward idea, so you might not have to do 5 listenings or really break it down too much. But once you feel like your students are getting a handle on it, play the recording, have them sing along. Next, remove the recording and have them sing along. Finally, we're going to go to our instruments and figure out the notes. Now, this is where you might be saying, Sean, well, how are my students going to know what to play? They don't have perfect pitch. They don't know what those notes are. You're going to want to give them a little bit of support in this area. You might want to think, all right, what key is this song in? This one's in B flat major. So most of your notes are going to come from the B flat major scale. You're going to want to tell them that. Your students might also know the B flat blues scale. So you can say, well, some of the notes, if they're not in the B flat major scale, they might come from the B flat blues scale. These 2 bits of information will usually be enough to get students started. Now from there, as you start to encounter more moving lines and lines that are a little more complicated than where we were starting with here, you might want to ask them, well, what direction does the line go? Does it go up? Does it go down? By how much? A big step? A small step? Are you not sure? If they're not sure, it's just time to make a guess. So if we have 2 notes that are farther apart from each other and we know it's going up, let's say we're going from a G and our target note is eventually going to be a C, just ask them to play, all right, what is a kind of medium-sized jump above a G if we're staying in our scale? They might say, all right, I'm going to go up to a B flat. They're going to play it and you're going to say, is that right? Well, no, that's not what the recording sounded like. Okay, let's try one that's a little higher. We try a C. Oh, that one works. So we know that our 2 notes are G to C. By encouraging students to stay within a sort of confined scale, we can really help them to feel like there is a right answer, which there is, but sometimes it can feel hard to find that right answer if we just think, well, I could choose any of the notes. No, most of the jazz musicians who were going to transcribe were playing sort of in a relatively diatonic fashion, so they were inside the key for the most part, so we can really use that information to help guide us in our note choice. Okay, once we figure out that first lick, that's it for day 2. Now, when we come back to this solo at our next rehearsal, day 3, we're going to start with that first lick. We're going to listen to it 1 to 2 times, and then we're going to immediately sing it and immediately play it. Whether students are feeling really confident or not, you're going to move on to that next lick in this case. And so our next line sounds like this. Now, there we have some more movement, and there's also a note that's not in our B flat major scale. So going through the process that we just talked about is important here. So our first 2 notes are a G to a B flat. So we would first listen a number of times, sing along with the recording, maybe sing along once or twice without the recording, and then try to play it on our instruments. Some of the students will probably get it relatively quickly, and hopefully those can kind of help move along some of that are struggling a little bit more. But if all of them are struggling, you've got to really go through that process where you say, all right, our first note is a G. We're going upward. Is that a small step, a big jump, a medium-sized jump, and help them figure out by staying within that scale, either the B flat major scale in this case, or maybe the blues scale possibly, about finding some of those new notes. All right, on to day 4. We're gonna sing our first 2 chunks, and then we're gonna play them. Da, da, da. Da, 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 da. Now, I'm not overly concerned with pitch accuracy. I want it to be there if it can be, but I'm not super concerned about it. And I'm also not concerned about any syllables. I just sing it all on a da. Yeah, you could get into some of that stuff, but that's not the main focus here. Now, if we're able to sing and play our first 2 phrases really well, we're gonna just continue to go phrase by phrase through the rest of this solo, taking probably 1 to 2 phrases at each day, depending on how quickly your students are advancing. Now, when you get all the way to the end of this first chorus, you're gonna encounter an idea that's a little bit more challenging. This is where some of your students might get a little bit stuck. If this happens, there's a couple avenues that you can explore to help them get unstuck on these more fast-moving or difficult to hear lines. The first thing is to slow the track down. Now, some purists might not like this suggestion so much. I definitely know some jazz musicians who say you should always transcribe at the full speed. However, I tend to find for younger players, and especially players who haven't developed their ear quite that much yet, they need to slow things down sometime to make sure they're accurate so they can hear those pitches. You can either do this on YouTube, or there are a bunch of softwares that you can use that will slow this down without changing the pitch, so you can really work on singing those notes accurately and then figuring out what they are on your instrument. The next thing you can try is getting super microscopic with how much you break it down by. Maybe dividing students into some groups, or even giving maybe a measure or 2 beats as a small homework assignment to learn at home. If we said group A was in charge of learning the first 2 beats of the first measure of this lick, it would sound like this. Now that's only 3 notes. That seems much more achievable than learning that whole 4-measure phrase. Then group B, they learn the next 2 beats. Now all of that so far is just in the key of B flat major, kind of connects to the 5 chord here, but it is all in B flat major. So these are all diatonic notes. There's nothing extra in there that they have to figure out. They just need to really break it down super small chunks and pretty slow. Then when you come back together, Group A puts their stuff together with Group B, and you've got the whole first measure. You go through this process on the entire phrase, again, as sort of like broken down or as small chunk as you need to for your individual students, and soon enough, you'll be there for this last lick. Now, the final thing you can do if your students are really struggling is it is okay for you to give them the answers. My only caveat here would be is actually teach them to play it by ear rather than just giving them the sheet music. You can find most of these transcriptions online, either in a video on YouTube where it has it kind of scrolling along, or just a PDF somewhere. However, that is a real shortcut that is unhelpful to us learning how to improvise. When we're learning to improvise, we're really training our ear to hear an idea in our head and have it come out of our instrument, not to see it on the page. When I was editing this video, I realized I wanted to pop in here to clarify what I meant when I said that using a pre-transcribed written out solo is not helpful to our development as improvisers. Now, these sort of solos can be great resources for us to check accuracy on transcriptions that we're working on, to maybe help us if we get particularly stuck in a challenging couple bars, or even to work on playing the style and sight reading as we can play along with a master. However, they're not really the go-to way to work on our improvisation because we're not training our ear when we use this. There's many a young jazz student who's gotten the Charlie Parker Omnibook and thought, oh, this is gonna be it. I'm really gonna be able to sound like Bird after I work out of this, but it just doesn't work that way. You've really gotta put in the hard yards of listening to those recordings over and over to really learn it by ear versus learning it just off of a page. It just will not get you there in the same way. Now, they can be very helpful. I use them sometimes in my own transcriptions. I have my students use them sometimes, but it's all about where we put these in the context of working on transcription rather than thinking that this is sort of like the magic bullet that's going to get us there. So when you go to teach this, you're going to teach it literally by rote by saying, all right, we're starting on an A natural, maybe telling the other instruments what that is in their various transpositions and working through it very slowly. If you can do this on a keyboard or some sort of instrument where they're not going to be able to tell what you're playing, I think that is useful because, again, they're engaging their ears, which is really what we want. Trombone is particularly problematic here because it's so easy to see those slide positions. But this is the avenue to success if your students just really get stuck on a section and need that support in learning it, and that's okay. Our final step here is to play it along with the recording at tempo, trying to get all the stylistic and feel nuances that Miles plays. If you wanted to take this a step further, you could pull some of the ideas that are in the solo and try to work them in some of the other ways you might practice improvisation. For example, I really like the third idea he plays. That's just sort of a tasty blues idea that you could practice as a piece of vocabulary. Maybe move it through some different key centers, or even just practice plugging it in a solo. Now, if you really wanted to go sort of all the way with this, if you were working on a B-flat blues song in your rehearsal, you could actually have everybody play this solo during the solo section of that song. It'd almost be like a full ensemble soli section or a shout section that would be part of the improvised section. Maybe some soloists take some solos, and then the last solo is everybody playing the Miles Davis solo from Freddie Freeloader. That would be a great way for students really to hear the connection with the material they're working on in this transcription process that we just went through. All right, we made it through that first transcribed solo. I really encourage you to try some of these things with your students. This area of improvisation work, for me, is literally the only way that you can become a better improviser. It's not the best way, it is the only way. Everything else we work on, scales, learning licks, learning music theory, should all support transcription, not the other way around. And so we want to make sure we're leaving time to work on this with our students.